All right. Okay. Hi, everybody. This is me again. And I keep saying I'm going to move past the age of 11, but then I keep remembering more stuff that's not only interesting, I think, but also important to events that will come later in my life. So here we go. Ages 3 to 11, part 3, starting from age 0, actually. No, ages 0 to 11, part 3, sorry. And so first of all, well, I was circumcised at 8 days old, like most Jewish boys are. My mom says that before that happened, before the bris, she was popping codeine, codeine pills and drinking whiskey. And then she breastfed me. The idea was to give me some anesthesia, which I guess was nice of her. And then apparently I only made one little noise. And I have been to one bris since then that I can remember. And boy, that poor little boy screamed. So I guess that's good, all things considered. So yeah, when I was 3, my father took me to on a trip to Baja California. I don't remember this because to make me not be upset when my mom went off to Europe. We were all taking a vacation, so that seemed to have worked. And I got to splash in the ocean. He wrote an essay about it, which I read. He said that this guy, he said he was really gentle, nice guy that we met, and he came down to me and spoke to me as to an equal. And this guy later moved to the Haight-Ashbury during that whole thing and became an LSD dealer. And he carried his money and his drugs in a briefcase that was handcuffed to one arm, to one hand. And later he was found dead with that arm missing. I think when I said that the Haight-Ashbury scene stayed good for a year or two, I may have been overstating the case. I don't think it stayed good for very long, actually. And yeah, a lot of stuff happened that wasn't so great. So that's that. But the good and the bad come together. The joy and the suffering always come together. That's how life is. So back to Belize. There's just so much to it, even before I went back as a teen. So I said that they are more or less an English-speaking country. First of all, it was called British Honduras and was a British colony in those days. And I said that it was more or less English-speaking. What I meant was that people speak basically a Caribbean Creole like they do in the rest of the formerly British Caribbean. And it can be hard to understand until you get used to it. But most of them can speak standard English when they want to. However, there are still some old people, or at least there were still some old people in the villages that could not. They could only speak Creole. And the Creole apparently got less creolized over time. A Creole, according to linguists, is a mix of 2 or more languages that is not just used for business. It's people are born speaking it, and it's their primary language. And when that happens, it tends to evolve into a real language with a larger vocabulary and some rules of grammar that make it work, that all functioning languages need to function. So Gales Point was on a lagoon, not a bay. That was my mistake. And I mentioned there a big day, which was September 10th, St. George's Key Day, and it was a big holiday, and it was like their biggest holiday of the year in Belize City. They always had a big parade and to do and festivities. So what was it actually celebrating? St. George's Key Day was the day when the Baymen defeated the Spanish in battle. According to Wikipedia, they were joined by other residents and slaves, current slaves as well as former slaves, I guess. And who were the Baymen? The fact is, mostly they were pirates. There were a lot of pirates around in those days because, like Belize has all those mangrove swamps, like the one that led to mangrove swamps and mangrove mazes, like the one that leads to Gales Point. And so a lot of pirates like to hang out there. Now ships full of drugs from Colombia like to hang out there. So some things don't change so much. And Belize itself, by the way, is named after a pirate. The name was Wallace and got changed via the creolization process to Belize. Later, they said, no, that's not true. It comes from a Mayan word, but nice. The whole country is named after a pirate. In those days, just one city was named after a pirate. So, just a couple things I didn't get into because I didn't really remember them, but I learned them later. My mom lived there and she told me these stories. So we didn't live entirely off of breadfruit and fish. There was what they call bushmeat, which was any animal, basically any animal that they caught, and they would catch any animal they could and turn it into food. So we ate things like tapirs and peccaries. So peccaries are big like guinea pigs, and tapirs are little with kind of an elephant-like nose, but they're actually they're not that little actually. They're, I don't know, maybe the size of a large dog. And they have these elephant-like noses, but they're actually more closely related to horses. So Grania said, yes, we ate things that you only see in zoos. And that was true when I went back later as well. Somebody asked me if I saw any exotic animals. And I said, mostly I just saw them on the dinner plate, which was true, except for the iguanas, but we'll get there later. So Ms. Jane, the woman that took care of us, and that was Ms., she went by Ms., not Miss or Mrs., she had a man, not a husband, but a man, a long-term relationship, fathered many of her children, fathered many children by her, and he had one leg. And the reason he had one leg was because one day he was off in the bush, meaning the jungle, probably hunting, and he got bit on the leg by a tommygoff. A tommygoff is a very poisonous snake. And he had a machete with him, which they, often do because, like, the machete it's like their version of a Swiss Army knife. This is true in many Caribbean areas and many tropical areas. And so he took that machete and he cut his own head off. maybe at the knee, I'm not sure. Sorry, he did not cut his own head off, but nearly as dramatic, he cut his own leg off, maybe at the knee, I'm not sure. So, my mom said she would get these flip-flops, you know. There was a boat that would come by every once in a while, and that was the only way that you could really buy things without going all the way to town. And she would get fabric and give it to people. You know, this was like her way of paying for food and lodging in a largely cashless, in a largely moneyless, actually, society at that time. And she would buy flip flops, and one of them would usually break. She bought them for herself, but one of them she'd give the cloth to people. And then one of the flip flops that she wore herself would usually break, and she'd have one flip flop, which isn't terribly useful. So she would give it to Ms. Jane's man. He only needed one, he only had 1 foot, and he really appreciated it. So there was another character there named Brother John, and apparently he was an old man and maybe a bit senile. The other people weren't so interested in him, you know, the locals. But she would hang out and he would play his drum and he would kind of ramble. She said like half his words were African words. And then he would sometimes just sing random songs he'd picked up. And then sometimes he would sing or pray to spirit entities, maybe gods. And she said this wasn't really part of any religion that had a name. It was just something that he did. So I seem to have picked up a bit of that by osmosis. She wound up taking his drum with her. The drum now is in my possession. I have it in my apartment. It is, it's made with an oil drum. The top of it is like some kind of leather. It's got wires around it, and it's got ropes around it, and it's got driftwood. And that's what it's made out of, all found objects. And apparently he made it himself, or somebody did. So yeah, that is the drum. You can see that I have made some notes here so that I do not keep forgetting things, and I can finally get through to the end of age 11 and move on. So one thing I do remember some of, my father traveled basically as far south as you could in Belize before it turned into another country. There was a town that you could only get to in those days by ferry boat, very far south, and it was called Punta Gorda. If you wanted to go further than that, you had to hire a private boat. So he did that, and I came with him one of those times. I later I went back, and the trees are just full of iguanas, which was really cool, but I don't remember it from the first time. So apparently he had bought what was then a functioning plantation. So my father was a great writer and a terrible businessman. His business plans were as exotic as his writing. He didn't just want to open up a bookstore in San Francisco. No, they all were exotic. He had tried to start a shipping company, but that didn't work. So then he got a hold of this plantation. He had a little background in agriculture in a kibbutz. He had herded sheep and picked oranges, and then went back to the U.S. and took some agriculture classes. But that all doesn't translate so well to tropical agriculture, but it was beautiful. And the laws at the time said you could get very cheaply and then own a piece of land if it had crops, food crops, which it did, a bunch of fruit trees and such. It had to have a house, which it did. I remember that. It was made largely of thatch. Certainly the roof was, maybe the walls too. And the ground was made out of packed dirt. Packed clay sounds dirty, but it really wasn't. These packed clay floors were solid and you could lay on them without getting dirty, unless obviously you spilled something liquid. And so it had that. It also had to have an outhouse, which it did. All that stuff was there when he bought it. And the final requirement was he had to pay the cost of a government inspector going there to verify that it had those things. Once he had done that, he would own it. And that last part, he just never got around to. He left the country suddenly for reasons I kind of get into later. And he kept paying taxes, and on, but he paid for someone to maintain the place. They didn't, long story short, and we'll get into more of that later on. So, in Belize City, my father had a local girlfriend. I'll call him Sharon. I'll call her Sharon. But he wasn't really in love with her. He was in love with an American woman, the mother of the little blonde girl that I used to hang out with. That's who he was really in love to, and they were good friends, although she wasn't interested in him in that way. But she could pick up on something. She picked up on something, and she knew. She got jealous of this other woman, understandably. Well, he tells the story that he got a manuscript that he had to edit it like it was due yesterday, that kind of thing. And he knew that his girlfriend would not give him enough peace and quiet to actually do the job. And there was only one place in Belize City where she would not be able to follow him because she would not be let in. And that place was called the Big C. The Big C was Belize City's most famous, and actually the only one I ever heard of in Belize, brothel. Most of the prostitutes there were free agents with their own room or whatever. But this was an actual brothel. And he went in and rented a room and edited his manuscript. And he says that once in a while, a Salvadorian woman in a see-through negligee or something would come in. And then the guys who ran the place would say, "No molesta el profesor," meaning don't bother the professor. And he claims that's all that happened in there. And so he edited his book and went home. When he got home, the woman was gone. All his stuff was destroyed, his clothing slashed. And most ominous of all, she had left an obia sign. Now, obia in the British Caribbean, it's not exactly a religion. I mean, it's derived from some African customs mixed with some other New World stuff. But it's not like Vodun or Santeria, which actually are full religious systems. This was basically magic, and a lot of it was bad magic, magic either to control people, to get, someone to fall in love with you, or harmful, or to cast a curse on people. Yeah. And he was pretty sure that this had been to cast a curse on him. When I told my mom that, she said, well, it was certainly a long-lasting curse. It had a long effect. This was much later. And kind of, yeah, his life didn't go all that well after that, in a lot of ways. Yeah, so, oh yeah. And oh yes, before I went to Belize, okay, a little out of order still, but I lived with my mom in an apartment in San Francisco. She read to me out loud The Hobbit. And after she finished reading The Hobbit, she said, well, there's more, but it uses a lot of big words and it's harder to understand. I don't know if you want me to read it to you. And I said, go ahead. So she read me the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy, and I stayed interested. I don't remember that much of it, but I stayed interested, and later the Lord of the Rings trilogy became very important in her mind, at least. There was a guy, a friend of the family's from science fiction circles, especially a friend of my mom's. He worked in the neighborhood as a mailman, and he would, I would wave to him, he'd wave back. I thought, oh, it's so cool. A mailman to me was like, a policeman or a fireman. It was like a heroic figure in a uniform, even if he did have long hair and a beard and all that. So, and I remember one time I said that I wanted to see naked bodies. I said, I wanted to see people's bodies naked. And he said, well, what do you want to see? I said, well, breasts, penises, vaginas. He said, okay. And then he later brought me some nudist magazines. There was no sex. It was just naked people. That might be considered weird nowadays, but I don't think it was anything bad. What was bad was that later he got involved in the Stephen Gaskin group. Stephen Gaskin is a pretty well-known guru, started in San Francisco State, having a non-credited class on Monday night. Not so much a class, just talking about whatever was on his mind, which was his style. And then he went, led a bus caravan speaking around the country, and then he got some land in eastern Tennessee, which I don't think had happened yet. But his philosophy included telling people where it's at, meaning criticizing them. It was never good when you told them where it was at. Where it was at never seemed to be a good place. And that included children, and they were, basically it was just chewing people out was all it was. And so he came and visited, and I did something, and he said, we don't want, you're ripping off our energy. I didn't come here to have my energy ripped off, which was all Gaskin-esque jargon. And it's like, my mom said his personality really seemed to have changed for the worst. Yeah. So Gaskin made him uptight. And then I'll talk a bit more about the pets. So when my father got those little puppies, he also got their mother temporarily. And this was in Petaluma, which is known for having a lot of chicken farms. And these little dogs, they got the little ones, Herman and Mudge, were really little. The mom was a little bigger, more like the size of a cat. But somehow they got into the yard next door and massacred a whole bunch of chickens. And I guess that is what you get for naming your dog after a serial killer, which is what Herman W. Mudgett was. So the guy next door with the chicken farm, I went over and saw him having a huge chicken barbecue. And he said, yeah, your dogs killed my chickens, and if they come into my yard again, I'll shoot them. So we were very careful that didn't happen and sent the mom back where she'd come from. And they never did anything like that again. They never were rampaging or, killing animals. So it probably was the mom's influence. But whatever. Yes, Sausalito. So I guess this is more organized by place so much than by time. I was about 6, and my mother and stepfather smoked marijuana regularly. My father had tried it a few times and just didn't like it, which made him seem very uncool to the hippies. He was around them a lot. He was a generation older. They kept trying to get him to try marijuana again, but he never liked it and just gave up after a while, quite sensibly. He liked hashish for longer. He'd smoke it once in a while. But then later he gave that up too. So my mother and stepfather and some friends were smoking out of a pipe, and I was about 6. I said, I want some. So they gave me the pipe. Not good. And fortunately, instead of sucking it like you're supposed to, I blew into it like it was a bubble pipe, I guess I used before. And apparently it ruined the weed, and it also kept me from using marijuana until I was at the advanced age of 12, which I think is for the best. Yeah. One time they were taking me to a local bookstop. My mother and stepfather took me to a bookstore to get some kind of a kid's book. And there was this guy there, and he grabbed this copy of Robert Crumb's Fritz the Cat, and he said, oh, you should buy this one. This is a great book. Robert Crumb, if you don't know, was an underground cartoonist, and his art was freaky and kind of perverted. But, and I said, well, I want something that's for kids. It's pretty easy to read. He said, oh, yeah, this is easy to read. And look at all these pictures and stuff. And then he left. And my mom said, look, the only reason he told you to buy that book is because he's angry at his own parents. That didn't quite understand that. And then she said, I forbid you to buy it. And then she backtracked. And she said, if you really want me to buy it for you, I'll buy it. So she bought it. Fritz the Cat by Robert. My early sex education came from Robert Crumb. That may explain some things. And after that, they started buying underground comics and leaving them around. And I read all kinds of crazy stuff from these comic books that were not supposed to be sold to minors at all. So, oh yes, other pets with weird names. My stepfather's mom gave her a cat named Goo Goo. They changed it to Chairman Mao, or just Mao. And it was a Siamese cat. And also they got a beagle. My stepfather named it Benway. So my stepfather was a doctor, and Dr. Benway was a reoccurring character in the novels of William S. Burroughs, who was a strange man that wrote strange books. Dr. Benway was a doctor who was very unethical and incompetent and corrupt and used drugs and so forth. So I guess he identified with that. And that poor beagle got hit by a car not too long after. A little after that, I was walking in the woods with a friend. About 7 or so. The woods were near my house. And all of a sudden, my friend started yelling something about bees. And next thing I knew, there was a swarm of yellow jackets on both of us. I think I said, these aren't bees, they're yellow jackets. And then we were running home, and they are horrible, horrible little beasts. They come at you from behind and get into your hair. I was like pulling handfuls of yellow jackets out of my hair. And I think at some point again, he said bees. And I said, they're not bees, they're yellow jackets. He said, yellow jackets. Even then, I was intent on correcting him. So then we got home, and my stepfather immediately pulled our clothes off and threw us in the bathtub and ran some water, turned on the shower and plugged the bathtub and got those freaking things off of us. He got bit, the poor basset hound that had a very unlucky life. She got bit in her mouth, and awful experience. I still hate yellow jackets. I've been bitten by them several times since. They are one of nature's nastiest creatures, in my opinion. Scourge of North America. And then after that, I had these swollen bites for a while. I had bites on my earlobes. I had bites on my fingers and my thumb. That was just horrible. So later than that, my parents sent me, they sent me to the movies alone, which they often did. And I'm not sure how old I was, maybe 9 or something. The movie place showed old movies that were already old even then. And so one of them was the movie The Fly, which is about a man who winds up doing an experiment, goes wrong, and it gives him the head of a fly, a giant head of a fly, and a giant hand of a fly on a human body. And then it gives him a human head and hand on a tiny little body that gets trapped in a spider web. Oh, that movie scared me. It scared me. And I remember going up to somebody, like in a restaurant or something, and saying, I'm having scary thoughts. And he said, did you do any drugs or anything? And he said, no. So we went up calling. I must have gotten the number from me, calling my parents. And so they came and picked me up. And then my stepfather said, look, you can't be doing that. You got to be able to hold it together. If you want me to let you go to the movies, you can't be losing it to the point where you need to ask other people for help. And so there was those two incidents. And plus, speaking of underground comics, there was one they left around called Insect Fear. And this was a gruesome comic book in which people would change into insects. Insects would be disguised as people, giant insects. They'd rip people's guts out, and awful stuff. So between those two experiences, oh yes, and there was another movie called The Hellstrom Chronicle, which was about how one day humans were at war with insects, and it was insects were going to win. They were just going to win. And he had this personality of a professor. He claimed to be a professor that was had been, lost his jobs and his academic credentials and his friends because he was claiming this theory, which he believed to be true. Later, I saw it again and realized that was obviously just a fake character. He was just an actor. But I don't think I knew that then. So basically, I developed an obsession and fear of insects that lasted a long time. But especially a fascination. And of them like disguising themselves as humans, of them just being these totally emotionless, like psychopathic creatures. And yeah, scary stuff to me. Um, my stepfather, as I mentioned, converted to Tenrikyo. A little more information on that. I mentioned that it had the influence from Buddhism of they believed in karma and reincarnation. But they also had the influence from Shinto, which kind of formed the shape and look and sound of their rituals. And they also did draw some stuff, although they never said so. They obviously drew some influence from Christianity, which is probably that Abrahamic framework was what made it accessible to my father. So they believed in one God, God the parent, one God, two genders, or both genders, or no gender. And they believed in a prophet, a woman who lived in the 19th century in Japan called the Foundress. And they believed in, they had a book. They had one book that was their sacred text. And so he liked it. And they also had a philosophy of cleansing your mind of bad thoughts, which was largely also a Buddhist influence. So he was converted to that. And I went, at that point, I found it very boring the first time. And frankly, their talks were pretty boring. And they go into and then they do the Japanese version, which went on way longer than the English version. So yeah, I wasn't as into it, but I did pick up a lot of ideas from it. Meanwhile, my mother and stepfather, who are also nominally Jewish, Reformed Jewish, yeah, which means they basically celebrated the holidays, and that was largely all. But they were dabbling in Tibetan Buddhism. So my mom took me to meet her teacher, who was a Tibetan man, a fairly well-known guy named Tarthang Tulku. Now, a Tulku in the Tibetan Buddhist system is somebody who is a reincarnation of a bodhisattva, which is someone who's vowed not to leave the earth until all beings, rather than just themselves, become enlightened. In practice, they're treated by many people, ordinary people, more like gods, more like traditional. Most polytheists treat their gods, but it's complicated. Anyhow, I met this guy. My mom said she was hoping that he would declare me to also be a tulku, but he pinched me on the cheek, like hard. I guess Tibetans are fairly physical, but I'd had like a great aunt do it, and I remember saying, I'm very sensitive to pain, and my stepfather said, cool it. Anyway, this time, this Tibetan dude did it, and I didn't like it, so I puffed my cheeks out, and my mom said, well, I was hoping he'd see you as a tulku, but after you puffed your cheeks out and all that, I don't think he will. Which was probably just as well. So, Japan. Yeah, some details I left out. So my stepfather had an ex-girlfriend who was Japanese, who was then living in Japan. He had gotten a science PhD before he got his MD in medicine, which is also a PhD. So he had two PhDs. But he had met this woman in the science program, and she had also been studying as a scientist. And so they'd been dating. I don't know the details, but they'd been dating for a while. And then her mom called her back to Japan to take care of her. And so her whole idea of being a scientist, I don't know if she had the degree yet or not, but it went out the window. And he later said she got more and more like a clock that's just wound too tight. You know, she had this brilliant mind and this ambition, and she just got stuck not being able to use that stuff. And you know, smart women weren't valued that highly in Japan at that time, which would have been about 1971. But we met her. She took us. We went with her to a kabuki show. My mom explained to me that the men dressed in black, you were supposed to pretend you couldn't see them. They were basically just for special effects. And there was a fight scene. First, this guy with a sword hits an actor on the face. The actor had a white mask on, and it fell off, and his face was completely painted red. So I could see the implication was that his face had been chopped off, and that impressed me. And then the sword hit somebody's leg, and the guy with 1.5 legs hopped away, and then one of those men in black with a stick made the stump of the leg run after him and follow him. So I remember those. I was like, wow, pretty cool special effects for, you know, a centuries old theater form. And then we got to the lobby, and my mom said, oh, that doll is nice. And the Japanese woman tried to buy it. It was very expensive. She stopped it. And I remember I was at my hotel. I had watched some Japanese cartoons, and my folks couldn't follow them, but I could. They said it was probably in some language only kids could understand. And that was largely true. It was in some cliches that came largely from, you know, American superhero lore. And I said, oh, that reminds me of a couple of cartoons I've seen back home, Speed Racer and Aquaman. And this Japanese woman said, I don't know. I don't know about American cartoons. But it turns out I was actually right, because they were not American cartoons. They were Japanese cartoons dubbed into English. So it was what later became known as anime. And I was able to figure that out. That's kind of interesting. Oh, yes. So then, and we went to Nara, which is famous for its deer park, which was supposed to be a recreation of the ancient deer park that belonged to a king who let the Buddha and his early followers use it to meditate in. Well, this one had a giant Buddha, and it had a bunch of deer, but the deer were there eating garbage. So not so nice. This was, you know, the cities were not, you know, they were polluted in those days. But then we went into the rural areas. We went to a bunch of hot springs. My brother was a toddler. He had curly blonde hair and blue eyes and a little button nose and bright pink cheeks. And the Japanese people just went nuts for him, especially in rural areas where they weren't used to seeing white people at all. He had everything that they didn't. And crowds of kids would like form around him. And yeah, so we saw a lot of Buddha stuff, and somehow me and my mom got on the topic of meditation. She told me to hold an image and a sound in my mind and just repeat the sound over and over. It didn't matter what it was. I visualized Donald Duck going whack, but that didn't hold my attention for very long. So that experiment didn't last at the time. And then somehow I got this into my head, and I asked my mom, is there such a thing as child saints? And she said, I guess, yeah, I suppose so. And then, so I got it into my head that I was a child saint. I don't know where that idea came from. You know, Jews don't really don't really have saints like Catholics do. But it was my first experience of spiritual grandiosity, which would be a thing for me in a lot in the course of my life. Anyway, my mom saw me acting weird and not talking, and she said, "Do you think you're a child saint?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, you're not." And that pretty much put an end to that for the time being. Okay. So now let's go back till, back to the age of 11. I'm finally getting back there. This woman, Daphne, who I met, I talked about last time, in the flea circus, and she made me an honorary member of this band that was otherwise all lesbians. I remember these two women, these band members, talking, and one of the women, she was talking in this like deadpan monotone that she didn't usually talk in. And she said, I have and she described a strap-on dildo. She described it accurately enough that I could basically understand what she was talking about. As if the other woman hadn't heard of it, which maybe she hadn't, because it was still the early 70s. And at the end, she said, many women find that enjoyable. And that was that. That stuck in my mind. So, and she also introduced me and my father to a couple of gay men. So I went to gay men, as opposed to just women. And I went to San Francisco, and I remember one of them was talking about this guy named, well, Garth or something. And he said, oh yeah, he's into fabric and animals. I was trying to wrap my mind around that. And the guy said, yeah, and he had a situation where he was working at the telephone company, and he wanted to take a week off of work. So he invented a machine that could do his job for him. And he left for a week, and then he came back, and he said, I'm sorry, but a machine has been invented that will do your job, so we no longer need you. You're fired. He had not patented that device. I don't know if that's true or not. My stepfather said, stories like that are more often told for entertainment. But later, much later, decades later, as a young adult, I read an interview in a local newspaper with this guy, and he was telling the same story. I'm like, I know who that guy is. And so then I wound up meeting him and saying, hey, I heard a story you told, and then I read it in the such and such paper. And he's like, oh, that's interesting. And then later, another friend of mine told me that he was also involved in making like amateur level gay porn. So, and one of the guys told my father, he said, I'm a rice queen. And my father, fully heterosexual, said, well, what's that? And the guy said, a rice queen is a gay man that likes Chinese food. He believed it, and he told me the story later, and I wasn't sure, kind of skeptical, but later I learned that a rice queen is, as one would expect, a gay man that likes East Asian men. So he was goofing on him a little bit. But he probably really did like East Asian men. So, yeah, so I can't help reflect on this on this woman, the first woman I ever had a erotic experience with. And, was she awake when the incident happened? I remember before it happened, the only thing I can remember that seemed a bit, in retrospect, seems a bit suggestive was she said, we were hitchhiking around, it was a hot day, and somehow uh, the topic of nakedness came up, and she said, I wish I could go naked right now. It's hot. But hippies went naked, so that wasn't such a strange thing. Later, after the situation happened, I met her again in San Francisco. She left a note that just said poop, which was something she said when she was disappointed. So everyone knew it was her who had left the note. And then she came back, and I went on a walk with her. And somehow the topic of adults who do sexual things with children came up. And she said, well, children are beautiful. And that was all. And then she brought up, she said, I know this boy who's always making whoopee. Whenever, he's always just making whoopee. And I said, what's making whoopee? And she said, well, basically masturbating is what she meant. I wasn't quite sure why she was telling me. All the information points to that, yes, she was indeed aware of the situation when it happened. And so therefore, I will consider this to be a victimless activity. Illegal, yes, very, but a victimless crime. And not long after it happened, I made whoopee with myself for the first time, not in public. The funny thing about it is that as sophisticated as I was, this was before she talked to me about it. I thought I had invented it. Apparently, I did not know that this was something every guy does. Even the most feeble-minded guys can figure out how to do it. But I thought I had invented it. And I was like, wow, if you put saliva on your hands, you can create an artificial vagina. And that was such a revelation to me. So yeah. So all of this may seem a little wacky. Those were very different times, and we were very, and it wasn't just her. Maybe after, or I'm not sure, but I did sit on the bus next to women, grown women, and touch their legs and such. And I honestly did not know that they didn't like it. I did not know how the process of initiating sex happens. And when one of them said, are you going to do this the whole way? And I said, yes. And she got up and moved. And that's when I realized that really they don't like it. So I stopped doing it. It really was a crime of innocence, not a crime, but obnoxious behavior that I did out of innocence, naivete. Yeah. So basically, obviously, you ask somebody, well, how is an 11-year-old boy supposed to get laid? Well, he's not. He's not supposed to. Not in a house, not in a mouse, not on a raft, not on a spacecraft. He's not supposed to under any conditions. But I didn't know that, and my body was definitely not telling me that. In the 1970s, I will say there was a very different attitude about adult adolescent, doing sexual things together. Not that young. That was still too young, but like teens, yeah. So This was the 1970s had begun, it was about 1973. The 1970s had begun. Clearly, sex talk and sex were in the air everywhere. And that was only the beginning. And hopefully next time I can get to age 12 and on. Good night, everybody, and goodbye. And stream. And